So first of all, good evening and welcome to everybody who's taken time to come this evening. And it's a pleasure to be at Berkeley and to speak today about the importance of the work that human rights defenders do in fighting for and protecting humanity's core values. We often take our fundamental freedoms for granted, but actually we owe those fundamental freedoms to human rights defenders. And the rights that we enjoy and often take for granted weren't just bestowed on us from above, as if they were some kind of gift or an act of charity. They were the result of struggles from below, often waged in the most challenging contexts, and often against the steepest odds. The right for women to vote, the right for workers to get decent pay, the right for working conditions, the freedom to speak, to protest, to choose who rules over you, the ability of children to go to school, or the sick to access healthcare. These are all rights we just take for granted, accepted today. But they weren't recognized just a few decades ago. And although they may not have been known as such at the time, the leaders of the freedom movements who fought against colonialism, apartheid, and other oppressive regimes were indeed human rights defenders. And human rights defenders gave us the most important document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of its key drafters was Hansa Mehta, an Indian freedom fighter, a feminist, an education leader. Hansa Mehta embodied the key struggles of her moment. She founded and led the National Women's Workers Group, which organized nonviolent, all-women protests against British colonial rule. And for her work to defend human rights, she was arrested and imprisoned 3 times. The Universal Declaration for Human Rights did not come about spontaneously, but it drew on other documents that had come before it, like the Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties that Hansa had drafted a few years earlier, which affirmed human equality, rejected discrimination, and gave equal importance to both civil and political rights on the one hand and economic and social rights on the other. Hansa Mehta gave us the very first article of the United Nations Declaration. During the drafting, Eleanor Roosevelt had proposed to affirm that, quote, all men are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And she was echoing the words of the French and American declarations on the rights of men. In principle, a statement of equality, but it excluded more people than it actually included. It was not a declaration of rights, but it was going to enshrine a set of entitlements, placing some people over others, particularly white propertied men. It was Mehta who challenged Eleanor Roosevelt's formulation and made a radical revision. All human beings, she affirmed, are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This simple yet profound change affirmed the universality of human rights, transcending gender, race, class, and other distinctions. And it stands the test of time, inclusive of all people, of all identities. Thank you, Hansa Mehta. So Mehta's vision also reminds us that human rights are not just a Western construct or something that came out of a post-war period when colonized countries were not part and parcel of these documents. And it wasn't just a foreign creed imposed by the powerful. This indeed was an effort that pulled from all places in the world. And it's an affirmation of the values that bind us together and a recognition that we have a shared humanity. Today, in today's world, to be a human rights defender is truly an act of courage. Across the world, we're seeing new ways in which governments are silencing defenders, subjecting them to surveillance, harassment, threats, intimidation. We see the online space has been very toxic, smearing human rights defenders as foreign agents, as traitors, as terrorists. In some places, human rights defenders are accused of thwarting development for demanding that businesses abide by human rights principles, or subverting traditional values if they insist on recognizing the full humanity of women and girls, of LGBTI people, and members of lower castes. And ever-tightening restrictions have been imposed on them to prevent them from carrying out their crucial work. They face threats to their organizations, which are deregistered, denied the ability to receive funding, or wind up in courts in legal cases that take years to reach a resolution, where the process itself becomes a punishment to tie up human rights defenders in work that is not their core business. And in the worst case, they've been subjected to unjust prosecutions, torture, disappearances, and even killings. And despite these immense challenges, human rights defenders get up every morning and remain the custodians of our most cherished values and the drivers of equity and justice. And they don't just defend human rights, they also advance them. Even in the most repressive environments, you find them, the single person holding a candle, driving meaningful change in the most difficult of spaces. And their work, in the best cases, leads to policy reforms, community empowerment, and the deepening of democratic participation. Sometimes their most profound impact is simply holding the line, just ensuring that hope endures for a more just and equal society, and keeping alive an alternate vision to the bleak ambitions of authoritarian state power. They can make the difference in even the most difficult of circumstances. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a vibrant and effective civil society network of human rights defenders that's based in the east of the country. And to counter the attacks on the human rights defenders in that area, they've devised an innovative strategy which they call the SMS cooking pot. It's simple and effective. When local authorities come and arbitrarily detain activists, particularly in the more rural areas, the network springs into action and mobilizes all the other defenders. They quickly share the contact detail of the perpetrators and the chain of command above them. Then they encourage their members of the network to send out targeted messages, denouncing the detentions, affirming the rights of the defenders, and calling for their release. This exposure and the concerted pressure brought to bear on those responsible for them raises the political costs of these detentions, and it makes the authorities think twice the next time they know that their moves are being watched. In more accessible parts of the country, the network springs into action within hours of an arrest or an abduction, reaching police stations to provide legal and moral support while publicizing the attacks. These closely coordinated rapid responses have led to the releases of dozens of activists, including those detained in very isolated locations where they're often beyond the reach of public scrutiny. Even in China, one of the tightest spaces for human rights defenders, during the pandemic, human rights defenders found a remarkable way to continue their work while confined to their homes. They took a simple blank white sheet of paper and hung it outside their windows. And soon this silent act of defiance, these individual images of white sheets gently rippling each night, came together to create a nationwide wave of protest. And it ultimately proved successful in easing the extreme lockdowns and eventually moving away from the harsh zero COVID policy. When direct expression isn't possible, the defense of human rights can find other ways. Even a blank sheet can say everything. The work of human rights defenders can take a long time to yield results. This is not short-term work. There's steps forward, but there's also steps back. There's obstacles that stubbornly stand in the way, but can also suddenly be swept aside and clear a path that opens up and leads to the ability to access justice that was never there. And it happens, and we see it right now. This is the kind of world we live in, where the changes happen fast. It's due to the persistent efforts of human rights defenders, many of whom have worked at great personal risk to gather the evidence needed to push for investigations, that you see prosecutions then occurring much later on. For example, former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, he's now standing trial at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity committed during his murderous war on drugs. Open Society Foundations very early on supported journalists and photographers who were documenting this. That evidence is now being used by the International Court. In Colombia, President Alvaro Uribe, who presided over the near decades-long ruthless military campaign in the name of his own war on drugs, he was sentenced for witness tampering. And it was the first time in the country's history that a former president was convicted of a crime and sentenced. Again, that's the result of decades of work by human rights defenders. Human rights defenders are the architects of accountability. Brick by brick, they build cases, and they turn fear and silence into testimony, moving from impunity to justice. And it's precisely this work, this patient, dangerous labor of holding power to account, that makes them targets. Where powerful actors fear accountability, they also fear human rights defenders. The organization Frontline Defenders has documented more than 2,000 attacks in more than 100 countries last year alone. These numbers included the killing of 324 defenders for their human rights work across 32 countries. Meanwhile, Global Witness has reported that 146 environmental defenders were killed or disappeared in 2024, underscoring the grim reality that environmental and land rights defenders are among the most targeted groups globally. And these figures aren't even the full picture. Many attacks against defenders remain undocumented or unnoticed by the media or in any other coverage. In some situations, attacks have become so depressingly normal that even defenders themselves take it for granted and have started to normalize these as the unfortunate but unavoidable consequences of going into this line of work. It's a reminder for those of us who have the privilege of working in safer situations how urgent it is that we defend the rights of those who've devoted their lives to defending the rights of others. The means by which human rights defenders come under attack have become more sophisticated as they face new frontiers of threats. So through advances in technology, which help human rights defenders on the one hand, on the other hand, governments and other actors now have powerful tools at their disposal to track defenders, survey their work, hack into their devices, and harass them online. In particular, women human rights defenders are especially vulnerable. They are relentlessly subjected to vicious online forms of gender-based violence, doxing, and other attacks designed to intimidate and silence them. The deeply rooted patriarchal norms that remain in evidence across all these contexts target them for their public work, seeking to stigmatize them for not playing the traditional role of what a woman should be, and even threaten their families. But that same technology is also being used by defenders as a tool to promote rights and justice. If you look across the global south right now, there's what's being called a youthquake, what we call a youthquake, where young people are coming out, young people who've grown up in dictatorships, who've never seen democracy, actually wanting more and speaking the language of open society and actually toppling governments through peaceful protests. And this wave of youth-led protests we're seeing across Asia and Africa have either swept away repressive governments or continued to hold them to account. All their organizing is in digital spaces. It's quite amazing. And where there have been restrictions on peaceful assembly, they've rallied in online spaces. Where they cannot gather in person, they organize online, sometimes across vast distances, and they create nationwide movements. And where governments seek to stifle their voices, they then find alternate platforms to speak out. And where they face repression on the streets, unleashed by governments desperately resorting to violence to cling to power, these abuses are documented and exposed, live-streamed to thousands of people and archived as evidence to be used for accountability. The crucial role that human rights defenders play in improving people's lives, fighting for our rights, and holding the powerful accountable also begs the question, who will defend the defenders? To enable them to do this vital work, we need robust protection mechanisms, and these mechanisms need to be designed with the defenders' specific needs in mind from the bottom up, ensuring that sensitive and relevant to the contexts that they work in, and designed to allow them to stay in place to actually continue to do that work. Traditionally, in the human rights movement, the protection mechanisms were situated in and operated from the global north. And they deployed a limited set of protection measures across all contexts. The default response to serious threats was to pull somebody out of their field, either till the threats abated or leave them permanently in exile. We were constantly relocating people out of their contexts. And repressive governments learned from that to exploit these situations. They discovered they didn't need to imprison or kill defenders to bring their work to defending human rights to an end. They could apply just enough pressure, threats, and intimidation to force them to leave and deter them from returning. What we need in today's world are new types of protection mechanisms that allow people to both get the security they need, but to continue the work that they're doing on the ground. In that regard, it brings me now to UC Berkeley. Universities have an important role to play in this effort in supporting human rights defenders. They can provide a temporary space for human rights defenders, not just to seek safety and respite, but to carry out research, to strategize, to train themselves before returning to their sites of struggle with renewed vigor. Universities are places where human rights defenders from around the world can meet each other, can learn from each other, can develop networks of support and solidarity globally. And they're also places where defenders can impart their own experience to students and faculty alike, sharing what they've learned through their unique lived experiences as practitioners and contributing to the fields of law, human rights, gender, environmental studies. Crucially, in these times, they can demonstrate through their example why it is so important not to step back, not to surrender to fear. Human rights defenders remind us that silence does not protect us, and anticipatory obedience is an admission of defeat. And it's a tradition that Berkeley can draw upon, reaching back to its free speech movement, support of civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War protests. And I hope that in these times you will serve that role for all those human rights defenders around the world that desperately need it right now. At the Open Society Foundations, we are really proud to partner with Dr. Chatterjee. Over the next 5 years, we will be working closely with her in a partnership, enabling the center and the university to protect human rights defenders in bold, creative, and innovative ways, and to create pathways for accountability for those who are silencing rights defenders in some of the most repressive contexts in the world. We have a long history at Open Society of supporting human rights defenders and their work, and we do it by providing flexible, rapid, and long-term support to those defending defenders, especially in emergency situations. We stand as allies. We stand in solidarity with those who risk so much to fight for open society values and to advance open society goals. These commitments include the co-creation of holistic ecosystems for protection on the ground where they're needed, wherever it is, in Colombia, Guatemala, Democratic Republic of Congo, elsewhere. These ecosystems go beyond emergency responses and legal defense. They create a safer, more sustainable environment for rights defenders to be able to continue their work. We look to create protection strategies that are community-based, that start from the ground up and address the specific contexts and needs of those defenders in that place. And this model that Open Society uses is inspired by an approach developed by the Environmental Defenders Collaborative, which stands on 4 pillars. First, prevent, target the root causes and systemic failures. Second, protect, equip defenders, communities, and organizations with knowledge and tools to continue their work safely. Number 3, reveal, uncover and document attacks, threats, corruption, collusion, and other assaults on defenders. And last, redress, hold perpetrators accountable, provide healing to the victims of trauma and violence. Through this framework, we work with communities and organizations to mitigate the risk to defenders, deliver comprehensive protection support, leverage accountability mechanisms, and pursue strategic litigation. At the same time, we amplify the narratives to build public support for human rights defenders and promote the importance of this work, and to expose the political economies that lie behind these attacks. To cite 2 examples of the different type of work that we're trying to do, we've supported quote-unquote rest and respite shelters for defenders in Ghana, Senegal, Nepal, Japan, temporary places of relocation for them where they can find the space to just breathe without fear, but stay close to their homes, connecting with other defenders and developing strategies. We've seen too many human rights defenders in exile, bagging groceries in Canada or in Europe and completely not able to actually use their talents as human rights defenders. We've also created fellowships for young lawyers in South Asia, ensuring that knowledge of the field is transferred and legal aid is sustained to be able to fight against the criminalization of defenders. Through fellowships, we're investing also in the next generation of defenders who will carry this mantle forward. So the protection of human rights defenders is one of the key pillars of our own efforts at Open Society Foundations, not just to promote rights, but also to reimagine the future. And it stands alongside other work we do on rights and dignity, to counter violence, to create safer communities, to advance progressive drug policy reform, to develop new pathways for migration. These are all areas of work we're working in at Open Society to ensure people can live safe and dignified lives and to take on emblematic cases that can deliver major breakthroughs in the law. 8 decades ago, when Hansa Mehta was part of the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration, she spoke of the importance of that moment, the inauguration of a new era of rights, where everyone would be guaranteed the same freedoms and protections. To create a new world, she said, it is necessary to create a new way of thinking. And that's our task today. When I think about the creative and courageous people who came together after the Second World War and built the international framework for human rights that we have today, which has carried us for a number of decades, but is now stretched beyond its ability to actually deliver. We have to ask ourselves, where is the moral imagination and the thinking and creativity to do what those people did when they wrote the Genocide Convention, when they wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when they banned landmines, then when they created an international criminal court? That's the challenge before us. The world we know is crumbling, and something new is going to come. We don't know what that is, but I think we have to be open to understanding that the old and reforming and shoring up the old is not going to take us where we need to be. We actually need a reimagination, and we need that reimagination to bring something else then we don't know what that is yet. And we also know that those of you who are students in this room are going to deliver it for us. We've taken you as far as we can take you, and all of the rest of you are going to take us the next mile of this journey. So thanks for coming tonight to listen.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I have a zillion questions, but I think I'm going to ask you this. I saw that recently you were interviewed on NPR, and then you had a quote on, I can say, Twitter, which no longer exists. Quote, "Attacks against open society foundations are not about us, but about the United States slowly losing its democracy, as we have seen in different parts of the world." And recently talking to law students expressing great hopelessness about being in law school at this moment. So this is a question that I'm hoping can speak to these students, where the rule of law is now turning into rule by man. And we see with, not obeying court orders, politically motivated prosecutions, attacks on judges, destroying independent inspectors, the threat of violence. It's just on every metric. It's extremely distressing, I think. And in this particular case, to students who are envisioning that they want to position themselves to use the law. And I'm thinking about that in relationship to Mariam Kaba's quote that hope is a discipline. And I know that you've thought a lot in all of your work about the role of hope. So I was hoping you can maybe say something about these ideas.
So the first thing I think of as I said in my talk, these rights that we enjoy, they're not just bestowed from nowhere. They're actually they're a continual act of struggle to maintain in different places. And those of you who are lucky enough to have grown up or lived in countries who've not experienced repression or dictatorship, that's how you want it to be. You want everyone to be able to live in a space where they have freedoms of associations, freedom of speech, freedom, ability to live without fear. These are all the emblems of an open society, and that actually the reason why George Soros wanted and promoted the idea of open society is because societies thrive in those kinds of environments in the best possible way. And where you see that, it's retreating. I think the most important thing is to not allow it, because for each erosion of rule of law that you experience, that is not challenged, that is allowed to stand, it emboldens people to actually continue. And when ground is lost in terms of rule of law, it's not easily regained. And so you're better off fighting not to lose ground than have to reconstruct or repair. You see, it starts with basically othering people. They're these people, and these people are people we need to fear because for whatever reason, they're different. And once you fear them, it preys on ignorance and the difference. And then once you fear them, then you have to hate them. And once you hate them, you then have to actually do violent things to them eventually. It's not a good road to go down. And so what we are seeing in the United States is the beginning of that. And I think it is really important that that is challenged in a variety of ways. It's very important. And it requires courage. The work of human rights is two things. It's very political, and to do it well, what you are trying to do is move power to people who have less voice or people who are being stripped of voice. So it's very political. And the second thing is it requires courage. And courage requires you to sustain yourself and stand in your own power and know that you are standing for the right thing and that you are standing on the right side of history. And so one of the questions in that same interview I was asked was, are you afraid? Because President Trump has publicly called for us to be prosecuted, for us to be closed, etc., as has J.D. Vance. And my answer was, no, I'm not afraid. I don't report to those people. I don't stand with those people, and I don't account to them. I stand for a different set of values, and those values I'm very clear on. So I stand in my own power. And I think all of us have to do it. It does not mean that you don't feel fear or you're not fearful, but the act of courage requires you to overcome that fear. And I would really urge everybody who's in this country, this is a moment. It's really a moment that's quite critical for this nation. It's not a given that democratic space will return to the United States. It's not a given.
Release.
Before I ask my question, Binaifer, I just wanted to say this morning, Binaifer offered an insight that I just want to share with you because it's kind of stuck with me all day, and probably it's going to stay with me for a long while to come. And this is something she said: not all battles are fought to be won, but to sometimes show up is the battle. Because when people show up, they show up and then they're able to set the record straight. So I just found that very inspiring. And I think this is a time for us to show up, even in the face of extraordinary power and the threat of repression. So I have two questions, which I'll just very briefly run by you, Binaifer. I mean, I'm a historian. I'm always very curious about what happened in the past and how we got here. And, thinking about OSF's origins starting in 1979, and then through, in a sense, the successes of the 1990s, it really seemed that OSF was at the forefront of a certain kind of bending of the arc of history toward greater democratic practice, rights, dignities, equity in governance. And then we had what looks like a backlash. And I just want to ask you to reflect on what you think has gone wrong, both within the US, but also, in a larger sense, globally. And I guess that leads to my second question, which has to do with, a kind of reflection on the world that we are moving into. We have seen various crises, it's the dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, then the financial crisis. And now, of course, most recently, we are looking at another kind of revolution with AI and the threat that poses to everyone's livelihoods, especially, a lot of us who assumed going to college and university was going to be the ticket to success. And I was just kind of wondering if you could give us a sense of how you see OSF positioning itself to be proactive in the face of these big future challenges. I know that, it's a little unknown to all of us, but that being said, I was wondering if you could reflect again on the future as well. So the past and the future.
In terms of the past, I think that quite significant gains were made after the Second World War in terms of policy reforms, in terms of acceptance and of the kind of universality of human rights, of rights of minorities, women, racial justice. I mean, there was a lot of progress. And in some ways, the backlash has been spawned by the success of those human rights movements that moved, again, power. Moving power is a hugely political act. When you move power and give voice to people who've been excluded or who've been on the edges historically, it is very threatening. It's changing and shifting things. And so we are now at a moment where you can see, at least in the US, that backlash has come. But it's tied with something else. And I think there's, again, things about the moment we're in now that there are very specific, complex, interlocking challenges that this planet has not faced before. We have the existential crisis of climate change. You have the new technologies that are impacting the way we communicate, the way we act, the way everything is sort of framed through these screens that, again, we've never experienced. And we also have the global economic system now stretched to its limits, and the growing inequality between very few people who are becoming extremely rich and the bulk of people who are becoming extremely poor. There's no longer a sense that this world offers a future to the majority of the people who are in it in the way that it's currently constructed. And that leads to a number of options. And one is where you look at things and you try and reimagine them in such a way that they include they come from an approach of our shared humanity and looking for ways to, it's not as if we don't have enough wealth on this planet. It's not as if we don't have enough food, or we don't, if there are ways to do it, but the way we have chosen to create economic systems and the way we do it actually, poverty is not just a happenstance. People are actively impoverished by the systems, the global systems that we've created. And we're now at that moment where the global economic architecture needs to be shifted. We thought that free markets, again, I'm saying the neoliberal system, this idea that the free markets were going to lead to wealth, that free speech is going to lead to the marketplace of ideas, that, this kind of idea that less regulation, less everything would be better. And I think we're now at a stage where that's clearly not the case. Governments have to step in, and they're going to have to step in ways that are multilateral. Now, where we're at, I think what we've got right now, we can either choose to just shore it up and reform it, but I think we're beyond that moment. You can try and shore up the UN, you can try and shore up the World Bank, etc., but that's not going to take us to where we need to be. We actually have to reimagine. So where is that reimagining happening? And interestingly enough, I think Open Society Foundations really sees where that optimism is, sees where that energy is. We're global. And where is it? It's in places in the global south that have large numbers of young people who are really speaking the language of open society and trying to think about how they can build a different future. We're seeing economists in the global south thinking about different ways to reorganize the international economic architecture. We're thinking about ways in which having, the way we enshrine human rights or the way we give people opportunity. I think also the way job markets are changing is also going to be another defining matter. It's sort of the same way as, I guess, when the steam engine was invented and suddenly we didn't have to be on horses and different jobs were created. It's going to create a moment where whole new sets of professions will emerge out of AI, out of technology, etc. We don't know them yet. And so again, we're in that crux moment. But I actually feel what we need to do is find those spaces of energy, find those spaces of imagination, and actually support them to push the world towards human rights, towards equity, towards justice. And if we can do that, whatever is going to come out of this moment of uncertainty will be a different world and hopefully a better world.
Alexa. Is that working?
Yeah. Yes.
Great. You spoke a little bit ago about the moral imagination, and it struck me in that moment that when we were talking about the threats to democracy and to the rule of law, we're often talking about the threat also to human rights. When we do that, we're often talking about the threats to rights themselves. But in thinking about the role of new technologies across this bigger ecosystem that you were just talking about, it struck me that we also have to be thinking about the role of being human and what it means to be human when so much of our life and our interfacing with each other is over digital technologies. I'm also thinking about, for example, Sam Altman and the challenges of trying to encode every aspect of a human being and to replace human beings with a set of algorithms. I think these are trends that are deeply dangerous, and I've been thinking a lot with colleagues about how do we better meet this moment, recognizing this existential threat. I was also thinking about the incredible work being done by Open Society Foundations that really helped to set us on our most recent trajectory of thinking about how new and emerging technologies are affecting humanity and how they can be both a weapon and a tool for communities in this moment. One of the projects that I know we briefly mentioned has been our investigations lab, which came directly in support of OSF, of seeing can we bring students together from across very different backgrounds, very different countries, very different disciplines to work together in support of others. So I've seen that play out in, for example, in the context of Myanmar, where Burmese activists have not been able to, have had to flee their homes and have asked for support in getting information out. Or in the case again of Myanmar, where there were hundreds of posts to Facebook that were incentivizing genocide, and how those disappeared so quickly because the tech companies have so much control over what we see and what we learn. But those pieces, because they were preserved by students here at Berkeley and elsewhere around the world, became material that could go to the International Court of Justice and could become part of a Pulitzer Prize winning series that would bring attention to what was happening. I'm curious, when you're thinking about this kind of a two-parter, how do you see collaboration in this space? How do you think about ecosystems of empowerment? Because I'm seeing that be such a critical way of sharing information and learning from each other right now. What is the role of the global north? I think we took up the digital technologies piece because we're right here on the edge of Silicon Valley. And we've seen it as trying to bring some of the conversations in Silicon Valley to support the rest of the world. I'd be curious your thoughts. You'll love that.
I think there's a lot in there. I think first starting with the ecosystems question, I think this is work that is not individual work. The work of human rights is a collective effort, and its strength is that there are frontline defenders and there are allies who work in solidarity, and that global solidarity of understanding that we're all human beings and that we have more in common than different is actually what fuels it, and how we organize ourselves. And so if you look at successful human rights efforts, I think the best ones come when they start from the ground in terms of frontline defenders who have lived experience and understand the dynamics to shift their local context, tied with others and learning from others who are similarly situated, and then pull together at the regional level and the global level. And that's something where Open Society Foundations really has had the privilege of being a global organization that can connect people. And those ecosystems all function in different ways as needed. And I'll give you an example. Right now, some of our old human rights organizing doesn't work well right now. So for instance, in Kenya, there were protests after the government brought a finance bill that would have raised taxes for the poorest. Those young activists, Gen Z activists, were organizing online. They didn't require money from us. They didn't set up organizations. They didn't have buildings. They didn't have, they just organized very differently, and they came out, but they were speaking the language of open society. And they were met with disproportionate force from the police. And then the ecosystems kicked in, because who was there when people needed legal aid? It was the old legal aid organizations that were still there, that have been there for a while, who were able to kick in and give these young people legal representation, or the medical organizations that were able to provide care to protesters who've been shot or beaten, etc. And suddenly the ecosystem changed and was able to work. So I think the ecosystem is important, and recognizing that there's parts of it now that are upgrading and changing, and we've not seen those before. I think the way Gen Z organizes is so different from the way our generation organized. It's just a very different way of, it's not wrong or right, but it means that now we need to adjust to new forms of organizing. It's something that's very dynamic. I can't remember your other questions. So, yeah.
Thank you. A brief announcement that there are note cards at your table, and if you'd like to ask a question, please write it down and we will collect them shortly. I would like to request Sharan Srinivas, in his role as Director of Protecting Rights Defenders at Open Society Foundations, and the prerequisite that carries of an inclusive and democratic society, to engage Binaifer in commenting briefly on this conversation.
Binaifer, you alluded to how, from Indonesia to Kenya, recently Madagascar, but also Nepal, young people are standing up against corruption for free expression and for socioeconomic justice. These are not the professional human rights defenders of yesteryear, but active citizens who are defending their rights and those of their communities. But you've also underscored how governments are quite really fearful of these cross-community coalitions more than anything else, and how they've cracked down with brutality sometimes unseen since the colonial period. I want to quote someone who is a friend to some, the esteemed human rights defender Harsh Mandar. He said, "Behind tall prison walls, some of the finest hearts and minds are locked away by a state that is fearful of their dreams." So with several traditional spaces that we used to go to, from courts to national human rights commissions, either cowering, compromised, and unable to provide remedy to human rights defenders, it's clear that we have to find new ways to achieve accountability and justice. And since, as you've alluded, that now it is these young people who are at the forefront of human rights movement and not NGOs, how should actors like those in the room, universities, philanthropies, reposition themselves to meet the moment?
So I think that's not a good question for me. I think that's a question for them, who are going to tell us how we need to shift and change and adjust. Because, sorry, I have my back to you. I just think that those movements are going to inform us onto how we can best help them, and they will lead the way in the same way that we follow frontline defenders in deciding. But I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, there's something about the human spirit that just transcends everything about all the other identity markers that we carry. And even in sort of fascist Spain, even if you have the trains running on time, people want something more than that. And I think that is just, you can't bottle that or keep it down. And so yes, you can lock away some minds. And actually, when I grew up in Kenya, people would disappear and be thrown into prison just for saying the wrong thing. And one of it was a notorious torture chamber. People were put in solitary confinement, and they wouldn't know who else had been picked up. And one of the lawyers who was detained said that when he came in, he was so scared, and he was thrown into a cell, and it was night. And then he heard another lawyer, John Kaminwa, who used to just sing late at night. And he would sing loudly, and the other prisoners would join him in singing. And just that act of being in solitary confinement, but just singing, so every time a new prisoner was brought in, they knew that John was there, and he would always sing. And so I just think they're just, even when you lock away those minds, they find a way to struggle.
Q. Laurel.
Is this one on?
No.
No.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Well, thank you. This is an amazing conversation. So my intervention is an invitation for reflection. The geopolitical climate in which the human rights movement operates has changed drastically and changed rapidly, and particularly over the last 15 to 20 years, where we've seen the rise of authoritarianism. Now, Open Society Foundations has been a linchpin of the human rights movement. Its influence has been felt not just because of the scale of its investments, although those are substantial and in and of themselves noteworthy, but because of how you've invested and what you've invested in. And part of this is the structure of the foundation initially, so creating foundations at the regional level so that those closest to the problem could decide what solutions would work best and fund those. And through the foundation's justice initiative, the organization took on strategic initiatives and a lot of strategic litigation. And through that work had a signaling effect. Not only did the work, opening doors, signaling which ideas, which topics were worthy of sustained legal advocacy and putting substantial resources into that. And so there was an investment, continued investment in a legalized approach to human rights that was an animating feature. R.A. Nair, longtime head of the foundations, had a particular vision for funding the movement that he took with him. Thinking of the international human rights movement as an ecosystem in which the foundation saw itself as funding the constituent parts. And so international non-governmental organizations worked generally top-down, and national, subnational NGOs and grassroots groups generally work bottom-up. What linked these two into the ecosystem was a theory of change around name and shame that targeted legal and political accountability as desired outcomes. Fast forward, times have changed, and so has the foundation. And you spoke earlier today that the old model of name and shame no longer works, and that the foundation is now spearheading new ways to support human rights globally. But I hear today that you still put a lot of faith in a legalized approach and thinking. There's a lot of talk about cases and accountability. And so I have a curiosity about where does law continue to fit in the constellation of actions that the foundation sees as promising. But more generally, I'd love to hear about how you're thinking about change and what the underlying theory of change now. If it's no longer name and shame, some ideas about the theories or logics that connects your programs, the various programs, and the funding priorities in order to achieve the impact that you've so eloquently laid out for us.
So even as things change, I mean, the sets of tools we have are still the same. I think that what we're seeing is, and I think this started with the war on terror, the hypocrisy of the US and Europe in terms of its human rights rhetoric began to erode. And I think it came starkly into focus with the issue of Gaza and the refusal to condemn what was happening. And the moral authority upon which the West had stood as being the keeper or the guarder of these universal values, I think was exposed as being very critical. And it lost its moral authority to preside over that system, and in fact began to actually dismantle it. And I think that has created an opening now to say, okay, and it's not as if, it's even as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights acknowledged the shared humanity. I mean, we had a global system that did have its own inequities. It came into being at a time when quite a large part of the world was still under colonialism. It accorded power in the Security Council votes and the vetoes in disproportionate ways that didn't divide power. Now we're in a very different world, and I think that this has now been the tipping point for a retreat away from. So it used to be when Aryeh was OSF president, we would have our advocacy people sitting in Washington and sitting in Brussels. Neither of those spaces are effective advocacy spaces at the moment. But there's many other spaces that are actually places of vitality. When Brazil had the G20, we did a lot of work there working with the Brazilian government. When it moves to South Africa, we'll do a lot of work. When it comes to the US, chances are we're not going to have traction. So you can see how the world is turning on its head in some ways. And the spaces where we are seeing the energy and where for advocacy around new ways of thinking sits with some of these innovative thinkers that are in the global South. And how to move, not all, but even BRICS. BRICS is if you look at the BRICS summit document that came out, the last one, it's very interesting. It actually puts in a number of open society values in there. And you can say, okay, that's China, Russia, Saudi, And yet the language, some of the language that's being there, because it's a microcosm of the world we're in just the same way as the United Nations is. But here's the emergence of something new that actually started in 55 with Bandung, and where Asia and Africa as colonial states came out against colonialism and racism and kind of got buried and subsumed. And I see it emerging now again in a different way. So I think we have to be humble about theories of change at this time, in the sense that I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think that there's the ground is shifting, and in this kind of soft ground, we have to be willing to think differently, try different things, etc. But I don't think that means that we throw out the baby with the bathwater. There will be moments where strategic litigation is going to take us to where we need to be. But as always, a case judgment is not going to actually guarantee you an implementation, right? You have the limitations of that. There's going to be moments where a name and shame report is going to make the difference. There's also the importance of really just documenting what is happening. It is important to ensure that the narratives of history are actually correct. Right now, we live in an era where where in politics, truth is disregarded. And the importance of truth and truth-telling remains. And so how do you do that? You do that by the documentation and that hard work of name and shame, of putting it all there so that it's there. And when the moment opens, and I think of Syria when I say this, where we were supporting efforts around documentation of crimes and never thinking that that moment would open. And then when it opened, it just opened. One day you woke up and there it was. And the person that we had funded to actually document these crimes was appointed in the Ministry of Justice to actually legitimize it through the government. And so those moments come. They don't come a lot. But when they come, you've got to be ready. And so I think that there'll be all of those. There are new ways of working and organizing that will emerge that we'll have to adapt to. And I think that's where the adaptability, the ability to pivot, and at Open Society, thinking about how much we lock up our funds in long-term programming versus how much we have to shift. Because I think that the crises are coming faster and faster, and we're seeing them, it used to be that you had a runway to adapt, but actually with each passing year, you're getting less and less notice of what the change will be.
I have a question that it comes from my work, and it is one I'm still struggling to think. At a time when the notion of the universal and international are undergoing unprecedented shifts, so too are the meanings of and guarantees to human rights and their protections. The local appears to be under siege, and communities are forced to contend with the religionization of state, racialized nationalisms, prejudicial laws, militarism, normalization of states of exception, occupation, and a growing majoritarian body politic. The shift is marked by the extreme proliferation of political violence against vulnerable groups and minority communities, and the remnants of old oppressions colliding with new ones. State actions have stretched well beyond the limits of legitimate authority, while weaponizing such action as lawfully permissible to justify exceptional methods in the name of national security. Established protocols internationally to hold states accountable have eroded significantly, and many are rendered meaningless. The world is indeed changing. The youth quakes and the extraordinary courage of countless rights defenders who live and work from the trenches. Despite that, the world feels intense in this volatile moment. At the intersections of the local and the global, what solidarities and institutional consolidations, what holistic ecosystems, as you have defined, must be leveraged to call for formative shifts to hold powerful states accountable?
So in some ways, we're seeing it, right? We're seeing Global South organizing emerging in different ways that we haven't seen before. In terms of holding power to account, powerful states, sorry, that's me.
It's okay.
And I actually think in terms of holding powerful states accountable, they're actually undoing themselves in some odd way. What the United States is doing to itself right now is disengaging in the international space in a way that is actually allowing other states to organize differently. By the time the United States comes back to the space, yes, right now countries are dependent on tariffs and willing to cut a deal. In 5 years, they'll have found other trading partners. They're not going to be putting themselves in the same position again. And so the leverage of the United States to be the powerful country that it seeks to be or seeks to remain will not be. We are not living in a unipolar world anymore. We're not even living in a G7 world anymore. I mean, G20 is, the BRICS countries have more people and more wealth than G7. And so just the sheer numbers, the demographics of where we're going will not allow for the world to remain the same.
Well, thank you for coming and joining us. And we want to thank all of us. We want to thank Binaifer Nowrojee for coming, for the inspiration, for talking about things that are despairing, but from it emerging with hope. And I think that's the challenge in front of us. We can't shy away from what is, and we must not give up. And the only way through it is what you have been discussing this evening. So thank you for your courage, for your work, and we hope to see you back here soon.